everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Tal Heinrich in New York, and this is the Investigative Journal. An American family is suing a Turkish bank over its alleged financing of the U.S.-designated foreign terrorist organization, Hamas. This isn't any normal terrorism financing lawsuit. One of the bank's largest shareholders is also a NATO member, a key U.S. ally in the Middle East, the government of Turkey. According to an announcement by the suing law firm, 4 children, the descendants of an American and Israeli couple murdered by Hamas terrorists, are filing a lawsuit against the Kuveyt Turk Bank for aiding and abetting Hamas's terrorist activity. For more details, I'm joined here on set by the director of the Middle East Forum, Mr. Gregg Roman, to walk us through the lawsuit and implications for banks around the world that hold terror organizations' accounts in the records. Greg, welcome. I see you have the lawsuit right here in front of your eyes, but let's go back a little. The story begins on October 1st, 2015. A Hamas terrorist cell murdered an Israeli couple. Eitam Simon Henkin, a PhD student at Tel Aviv University, who also held an American citizenship, and Naama Henkin, a graphic designer. They were father and mother to 4 children at the time, aged 4 months, 4, 7, and 9-year-old. Greg, give us some background about this terrorist attack here.
This couple, with their 4 children in the backseat of their car, were coming back from a class reunion, going to a small community that they lived in the northern West Bank called Nuriya, when all of a sudden a car pulled up parallel to them. 3 Hamas gunmen were in that car, with 2 other individuals who were planning the attack from where they were sitting in Ramallah. You then had these 2 individuals go alongside the car and shoot, both at the passenger side and at the driver's side. The car immediately stopped. 2 gunmen came out of the Hamas vehicle and then murdered these 2 parents at point-blank range, with their 4 children in the back witnessing the massacre of their mother and father. And if it had not been for the fact that the father held Israeli and American citizenship, we would not be sitting here today talking about the wide web of financial activity connected that helped propagate and sponsor that attack.
So let's really dive into this lawsuit. According to the complaint, the Kuveyt Bank is alleged to have, and I'm quoting, maintained at least 1 bank account and provided financial services to senior Hamas operative. His name is Jihad Yagamor, the organization's liaison with the Turkish authorities. Why does Hamas, Greg, have a liaison in Turkey?
Well, we really have to go back to what we were looking at in terms of Hamas's connections to the wider Islamist movement in the Middle East called the International Union of Good, which goes all the way back to the 1980s with the establishment of the organization under Sheikh Ahmed Yassin. Now, what happened is that when Yassin started off as a social welfare or Dawa organization in Gaza in the 1980s, there wasn't any intention to bring about violent activity. And the actual connection with Turkey, not the Turkish government, because in the 80s, it was not on that Islamist bent that we've seen for the last 19 years or 17 years under Recep Tayyip Erdogan. But move forward about 15 to 20 years, you see a gradual allocation of Hamas's fundraising activity, their logistics, and their eventual deployment of theocratic and ideological institutions moving to Turkey as the Turkish government became more receptive, not just to Hamas, but this wide web, as we said beforehand, of both the IHH, the largest Hamas-sponsoring organization in Turkey, and then the subsequent institutions that were the head of the IHH, including the chairman of its wider international network, the International Union of Good, who is also considered a Hamas operative by the U.S. government, a designated Hamas terrorist. Now, if you put these 2 things together, Turkey's interest in Islamism and its interest in sponsoring Islamist activities, at the same time, you think of all the institutions needed for that, whether it be banks, financial institutions, Sharia-compliant financial institutions that meet the modicum of what Hamas has to have to be able to use international transfers, all of them together become the perfect melting pot for Hamas activity in Turkey.
But again, we're talking about terror activities committed by Hamas. Doesn't Turkey view Hamas actions as terrorist activities? Otherwise, how can Turkey say we're fighting terrorism in places like Syria, for example?
If anything, what they do is they go by the old maximum that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. But in this case, their freedom fighters are using suicide bombings, rocket attacks, and indiscriminate shootings against civilians, both in Israel, in the West Bank, and in Gaza, and outside in many different areas where Hamas operates. The position of the Turkish government vis-a-vis Hamas in Gaza and also with its headquarters in Turkey has allowed senior Hamas terrorists to plan the kidnapping, the murder, and even all-out warfare against Israel for the last 10 years.
And of course, there's money behind
right.
all of
there's
that.
a lot of cash behind this.
Let's talk a bit about the money, because U.S. financial institutions like Citibank, for example, or Standard Chartered Bank, or even the British bank HSBC, they all hold assets in this bank that appears in the lawsuit, the Turkish bank in question here. Does it mean that they're all connected to terrorism in a sense?
It does. I mean, all you have to do is follow the numbers. So you have on one side the Kuwaiti holding company, the Kuwaiti finance house, which holds about 70% of the assets that's behind Kuveyat Bank, or Kuveyat Turk Bank in Istanbul. And then on the other side, you have all the assets which are held by this bank in the United States. And through the SWIFT transfer system, which is out of Belgium, but allows us to connect all the different accounts, you see this web which is painted in the lawsuit, which shows that those institutions, the Saudi, Kuwaiti, and Turkish institutions, which have a share in terms of the ownership of the bank, and then their American counterparts, which are facilitating transactions in the United States, going through SWIFT, and then back to Turkey, are all connected to the ability of Hamas to move money around.
Just to make things clear,
Sure.
Greg, we're talking about one murder, one terrorist act,
Right.
one lawsuit, but it's much more than this.
And it's not the first time that Kuveyat Bank has been accused of facilitating the financing of terrorism. There was an account which was brought in 2017 in a U.S. federal court in California, which alleged that Kuveyat Bank was facilitating the transfer of money to ISIS recruits, going from Europe, making their way to Turkey, and then through Gaziantep into Syria to fight against both Turkish forces. And you would think it would be a little bit ironic that they would be facilitating the transfer of money, which would then be used to attack their own nationals. But that court case was thrown out of a suit, or the lawsuit was thrown out of court because there was no connection to a U.S. individual. In this case, they murdered the wrong innocent civilian.
I want to read to you a quote here from the New York Post. Under President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, Turkey has become a permissive jurisdiction for rogue regimes and their illicit bankers. Between 2012 and 2015, Tehran relied on Turkish banks and a dual Iranian-Turkish gold trader to circumvent U.S. sanctions at the height of Washington's efforts to thwart the Islamic Republic's nuclear ambitions. It was the biggest sanctions evasion scheme in recent history. So the case we're talking about here isn't, as you mentioned, it's not really Turkey's first foray into supporting rogue regimes and illicit bankers. But can you explain Turkey's shift here?
Sure. So that article written by Jonathan Shanzer and Arkan Edyemir from the Foundation for Defense of Democracy, a sister think tank to the Middle East Forum located in Washington, D.C., points out not just the abuses of the international financial system carried out by the Erdogan regime, but also the rationale for why they've moved this way. If you start back in 2002, November of 2002, when Erdogan is elected as the prime minister of Turkey, his AKP party comes into power, you see about 7 years of a honeymoon, a nadir, if you will, with the West. He starts to liberalize markets. He starts to find ways to bring more human rights, if you want to call it that, to Turkey. Exactly. Anything on the swift ascension through that EU-Turkey membership agreement. And then in 2009, something happens. He's on a stage with Shimon Peres, the president at that time of the nation-state of Israel. I think Peres may have been on his way.
I know what you're talking about. A very, very famous video.
He's at Davos, and then he says to Peres, Mr. Peres, you are a murderer. Your regime is responsible for murderous activities. And finally, the emperor's clothes are revealed to show how Erdogan actually feels. Maybe not necessarily towards the West, but how he looks towards the Jewish state. And then over a 10-year progression, as we get to now, October of 2019 into November of 2019, we see that the actions taken by Turkey are very obvious. From the murder of their own civilians in Turkey, through their detention of hundreds of thousands of civil servants because of an alleged coup d'etat, which is questionable if it even took place, from their ability to cavort more towards the Russian and Chinese position of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization rather than their NATO membership. And now we have the silver lining. Evidence over multiple jurisdictions in Europe, in the United States, but also even facilitating the transfer of Venezuela's gold assets to protect it, as they continue their clampdown on the human rights abuses taking place in that country. Turkey is the center point of all illicit foreign financial activity for terror organizations, rogue regimes, and worst case, the major human rights abusers of today.
So circling back to the lawsuit, do you believe that it's going to be able to hold the Erdogan regime to account?
I think that if we look at the way that the Erdogan regime reacted to the Trump administration's calling them out for their activity, on the northeast and southwest borders of both Syria and Turkey, as we saw 3 years ago. The Erdogan regime response was to kidnap an American, and to actually kidnap multiple Americans, including Pastor Andrew Parsons, who was being held in Izmir for a year before he was released with the advent of American sanctions on that country. If this court case goes through to an absolution where Turkey and its banks are held responsible for the financing of this attack, and then the subsequent enforcement of that by the Department of the Treasury and the Department of Justice, based on this decision, Erdogan will lash out again, but he will invite the scathing wrath of the United States, just like he has every time he's tried to buck an American president's determination to hold that country accountable. So yes, I hope that it will change things.
Gregg Roman, interesting analysis. Thank you for joining us from the Middle East Forum. And thank you all for watching. We'll be back next time with the Investigative Journal from Times Square in New York City. I'm Tal Heinrich. Have a great day, everyone.